Let me tell you something that no cable news anchor will say out loud. The most dangerous weapon fired in this conflict was not a missile. It was not a drone. It was not some classified warhead sitting in a hardened bunker beneath the Nevada desert. The most dangerous weapon fired in this conflict was a sentence. 7 words, spoken calmly by a senior Iranian official sitting across from a CNN reporter on a Friday afternoon. 7 words that should have collapsed markets. 7 words that should have triggered emergency sessions in Washington, London, and Tokyo. 7 words that somehow most of the world processed and then forgot about by the weekend. Those words were this: oil payments must arrive in Chinese yuan. And if you just read that and felt nothing, I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes. Because by the time we're done here, you are going to understand exactly why those 7 words might represent the single most consequential financial statement made in the last 50 years. Not an exaggeration. I mean that precisely. Let's build this from the ground up. Part 1. The foundation nobody talks about. There is a system running underneath the global economy that most people never learned about in school. Not because it is secret exactly, but because it is so deeply embedded into how the world operates that it has become invisible, like the foundation beneath a skyscraper. You never think about it until it cracks. That system is called the petrodollar. Here is how it works in plain terms. In 1974, the United States government sat down with the Saudi royal family and made a deal. The details were not published in any newspaper. There was no televised signing ceremony. But the arrangement was real, and it reshaped everything. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in American dollars. Every barrel, every transaction, every contract, denominated in USD. In exchange, Washington would provide military protection for the kingdom. American soldiers, American weapons, American security guarantees, standing between the Saudi monarchy and every regional threat that wanted to swallow it. The Saudis agreed. And almost immediately, every other major oil-producing nation looked at that arrangement and made the same calculation. If the world's largest petroleum exporter is pricing in dollars, then we price in dollars too. Because that is how you stay relevant. That is how you stay in the market. Within a few years, the petrodollar system was not just a bilateral agreement between Washington and Riyadh. It was the operating standard for global energy commerce. The unwritten rule that governed how the entire planet bought and sold the resource that powers industrial civilization. Now think about what that actually means in practice. Every country on Earth that needs oil, and nearly every country on Earth needs oil, must first obtain American dollars before they can buy it. Japan needs oil. Japan needs dollars. Germany needs oil. Germany needs dollars. South Korea, Vietnam, Brazil, South Africa, every growing economy running manufacturing lines, running power grids, running transportation networks. They all need oil, which means they all need dollars, which means there is permanent, structural, unending global demand for American currency, built directly into the foundation of the modern world. That demand does something remarkable for the United States. It allows Washington to borrow money at rates that would be impossible for any other nation. It allows America to run budget deficits that would destroy any other currency. It allows the U.S. Treasury to issue debt that the entire world eagerly purchases, because everyone needs dollars, and treasuries are the safest place to park dollars while you wait to spend them on oil. The petrodollar is not just an economic arrangement. It is the financial architecture of American global power. It is the reason the Pentagon can maintain roughly 800 military bases scattered across every continent on the planet. It is the reason American economic sanctions can strangle entire national economies. It is the reason Washington's voice carries more weight in international negotiations than any other nation's voice. That system has run continuously, without serious challenge, for 52 years. Until now. Part 2. The Strait. Everyone forgot to think about. Before we get to what Iran actually said, you need to understand the geography. Because this is not abstract finance. This is about a physical place. A specific, narrow, irreplaceable stretch of water. The Strait of Hormuz. On a map, it looks almost insignificant. A thin passage between the Iranian coastline and the tip of the Omani Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it is roughly 33 kilometers wide, barely a gap, practically nothing on a global map. But through that gap, every single day, flows approximately 20% of all the crude oil produced on Earth. 20%. Not of one region's supply, of the entire planet's supply. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar. They all export through Hormuz. There is no alternative route. There is no pipeline running north or east that can absorb the volume. You cannot reroute 20% of global petroleum supply through a different passage. The infrastructure does not exist. Military strategists have a phrase for places like this: choke points. Locations where the physical geography of the Earth creates a single passage that cannot be bypassed. And by that definition, the Strait of Hormuz is arguably the most important choke point in the history of human civilization. Not the English Channel, not the Suez Canal. Hormuz. Because nothing else on Earth concentrates that much of the world's essential energy supply into a single narrow corridor. For 14 days now, that corridor has been effectively closed to American-flagged and dollar-denominated commercial traffic. American naval forces have tried to reopen it. They have failed repeatedly. President Trump personally urged tanker captains to show courage and push through. Those captains looked at the risk calculations and declined. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting the passage have skyrocketed to levels that make the journey economically irrational. Millions of barrels are sitting in steel hulls outside the strait, burning through holding costs daily, waiting for a situation that has not resolved. And then, on a Friday afternoon, Iran announced that the passage can reopen. But there is a condition. Part 3. 7 words that changed everything. Pay in yuan or remain anchored outside. That is the deal. Stripped to its core, that is what Iran placed on the table in front of the entire international community. We will allow petroleum tankers to transit through the most critical energy choke point on the planet. But the transactions must be denominated in Chinese yuan, not American dollars. Let me be precise about what makes this different from every previous challenge to the petrodollar. Over the decades, various nations have proposed pricing oil in alternative currencies. Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would price oil in euros shortly before the 2003 invasion. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency for oil transactions. Various OPEC members have periodically floated the idea of diversifying away from dollar pricing. None of it led anywhere meaningful. Those were proposals, announcements, theoretical positions without operational backing. What Iran has presented is something structurally different. This is not a proposal sitting inside a conference room. This is a condition enforced at a physical choke point that controls 1/5 of global oil supply. The leverage is not rhetorical, it is geographic. And here is what makes it even more significant. By the time Iran made that official announcement on Friday, the arrangement was not hypothetical. It was already running. Part 4. The two-tier system nobody reported. This is the part of the story that received almost no serious coverage, and it is arguably the most important detail of all. Since February 28th, the first morning of Operation Epic Fury, something remarkable has been happening in the waters around the Strait of Hormuz. Two completely separate operational systems have been running simultaneously, side by side, for 14 consecutive days. System 1. Chinese flagged and yuan-denominated tankers moving through the strait freely. No targeting, no harassment, no blockades established against them. Their cargo flowing smoothly to Chinese ports, transactions settling in yuan through Chinese payment infrastructure, business continuing as if no conflict existed. System 2. American-flagged and dollar-denominated tankers anchored outside the strait, unable to proceed, accumulating costs, waiting. Since February 28th, Iranian tankers have transported more than 11 million barrels of crude petroleum through the strait, every barrel destined for Chinese buyers, every transaction completed in yuan. Chinese vessels navigated those contested waters without a single incident. So when Iran's senior official sat down for that CNN interview and announced the yuan for passage condition, they were not proposing a new arrangement. They were describing an existing one. They were asking the international community a single question. Do you want us to make this permanent and official? That distinction matters enormously. A proposal can be rejected and negotiated away. A functioning system that has already been operating smoothly for 2 weeks is a different kind of thing entirely. It has precedent behind it. It has proof of concept. It has demonstrated reliability. Dismantling something that works is politically and economically much harder than simply refusing to build it in the first place. Part 5. What the military scorecard is missing. American military operations have achieved genuine tactical successes throughout this conflict. Pentagon briefings have displayed satellite imagery of destroyed missile stockpiles, drone manufacturing facilities reduced to rubble, Iranian military infrastructure hit with precision that left planners in Washington satisfied. The most significant strike came earlier this week, when American forces bombed Karg Island, Iran's primary petroleum export facility, the facility that handles approximately 90% of Iranian crude shipments to international buyers. Pentagon officials presented this as a decisive blow, a demonstration of American willingness to reach the most sensitive targets, a message about what Washington can destroy when it chooses to. Iran's response was worth studying carefully. Within 48 hours, Iranian tankers had been rerouted to the Jask terminal, located on the Gulf of Oman coastline, south of the Strait of Hormuz entirely. That facility sits outside the strait. It bypasses the choke point from the Iranian side. Exports continued. Revenue continued flowing into Iranian government accounts. The military target sustained damage. The economic leverage Iran had accumulated did not. This is the gap at the center of Washington's strategic calculation. Military objectives and financial objectives are not tracking together. The Pentagon is measuring success in destroyed facilities and degraded capabilities. But the financial architecture Iran has been constructing, quietly, over years, in cooperation with Beijing, does not live in any single facility. It does not sit in any building that a precision strike can reach. It lives in payment networks, in reserve compositions, in established trade relationships, in the accumulated daily reality of transactions that have been completed in yuan rather than dollars, proving that the alternative works. You cannot bomb a precedent. Part 6. China's Invisible War. Here is the detail that deserves the most careful attention from anyone trying to understand what is actually happening in this conflict. China has not fired a single missile. China has not deployed ground forces. China has not made aggressive public statements positioning itself against the United States. By every traditional measure of military engagement, China is entirely absent from this conflict. And yet, China may be the primary strategic beneficiary of everything that has unfolded over the past 14 days. To understand why, you need to understand what Beijing has been building in the background for years, while Washington focused on shorter-term concerns. China has been constructing an alternative global payment infrastructure. Its name is CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. It is China's answer to SWIFT, the Western-controlled network that processes the vast majority of international financial transactions and serves as the backbone of American sanctions power. When Washington sanctions a country, it primarily does so through SWIFT. Cut a nation off from SWIFT, and you effectively cut them off from the dollar-based global financial system. CIPS offers a different rail, a parallel track that does not run through Western-controlled infrastructure. During 2025 alone, CIPS processed transactions equivalent to approximately 245 trillion yuan in international trade volume. That represented a 43% surge compared to the previous year. The operational infrastructure for yuan-based global commerce already exists and functions. Iran's proposal does not require building something new. It only requires directing existing trade volumes through a network that Beijing has spent years developing and refining. For years before this conflict began, China was purchasing Iranian crude using yuan payments. For years, they were encouraging trading partners to build yuan reserves. For years, they were signing bilateral currency swap agreements with oil-producing nations that reduced dollar dependency at the margins. Patient, incremental, methodical preparation for a moment precisely like this one. When the strait closed to dollar traffic, all of that preparation became immediately operational. Chinese tankers already knew the routes. Chinese payment systems already had the infrastructure. Chinese banks already had the relationships. The moment arrived and Beijing was ready for it, because they had been ready for it for years. Washington was not. Part 7. The Cascading Logic. Now let us trace the logic forward, because the immediate situation is only one layer of this story. Imagine you are a finance minister somewhere in Southeast Asia. Your economy is growing. Your industrial base is expanding. Your power grid needs more energy than it did 5 years ago. You need oil imports to sustain the trajectory your country is on. Before this conflict, your pathway was simple and well-established. Convert your domestic currency into American dollars through your central bank's dollar reserves. Transfer those dollars to a Gulf petroleum supplier. Receive your oil shipment. Simple. Predictable. The way things have been done for 52 years. Now you are watching what is happening at the Strait of Hormuz. You are watching dollar-denominated tankers sitting anchored outside the strait for 2 weeks. You are watching yuan-denominated tankers moving through freely. You are watching Iran formalize a payment condition that redirects 20% of global oil supply away from dollar transactions. And you are calculating. If you build yuan reserves alongside your dollar reserves, you have an alternative pathway. You can access Gulf crude through CIPS rather than SWIFT. You can purchase Iranian oil at prices that have been discounted specifically to attract yuan-based buyers. You have optionality. You have insurance against future disruptions in the dollar-based system. The question is not whether that calculation makes sense. The calculation obviously makes sense. The question is whether enough finance ministers make it simultaneously to create a structural shift in global reserve compositions. History suggests that once a viable alternative demonstrates reliability, adoption accelerates. Nations rarely abandon functioning, cheaper systems voluntarily in order to return to more expensive ones. The psychological and economic switching costs go in one direction, not the other. Every day that yuan-denominated tankers transit Hormuz without incident is another proof point. Another data entry in the column of evidence that the alternative works. Another reason for another finance minister somewhere to run the calculation and begin quietly diversifying. The petrodollar system will not collapse overnight. That is not how systemic transitions in global finance work. They are slow, they are incremental, and then suddenly they are irreversible. The concern is not that the dollar loses its reserve status by next quarter. The concern is that the countdown timer on its unchallenged dominance, which was not running at all for 5 decades, may have finally started. Part 8. The Red Sea Compound. The Strait of Hormuz is not the only pressure point developing simultaneously. South of Arabia, through the Red Sea, runs another critical shipping corridor. The route that connects Asian manufacturing economies to European markets through the Suez Canal. Ships that cannot or will not attempt Hormuz have historically rerouted through this corridor instead. Houthi forces in Yemen, aligned strategically and materially with Iranian interests, have dramatically intensified attacks throughout the Red Sea shipping lane over the same period this conflict has escalated. Insurance premiums on Red Sea transits have climbed alongside Hormuz premiums. Commercial operators are being forced to choose between 2 dangerous passages or route entirely around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and substantial costs to every voyage. The compound effect of simultaneous pressure on both corridors creates a strategic reality that American naval planning did not model adequately. National strategic petroleum reserves can cushion the immediate economic shocks from supply disruptions. Stored crude can keep refineries running through a short crisis, but stored oil cannot permanently substitute for the physical reopening of maritime passages. And the longer those passages remain disrupted, the more aggressively alternative financial arrangements get explored, tested, and normalized. Reopening Hormuz may ultimately require accepting conditions that were not on the table when this conflict began. Conditions that are no longer set unilaterally in Washington. The negotiating table has expanded. Voices that American diplomats would strongly prefer remained silent now have leverage they have demonstrated in practice, not merely claimed in theory. Part 9. The Russia variable. There is one more element that deserves careful examination, because it illustrates exactly how rapidly the strategic landscape has shifted. The United States recently reversed its standing prohibition on Russian petroleum imports. Critics throughout European capitals responded immediately. This was described as a gift to Vladimir Putin, a political reversal that rewarded Russian aggression with restored access to American energy markets. The diplomatic optics were damaging, but the reasoning behind the reversal was brutally simple. Gulf supply disruptions created by this conflict were generating serious energy shortages in American domestic markets. Strategic reserve drawdowns were providing temporary relief, but temporary is the operative word. Washington needed alternative supply sources immediately, and the calculation of political cost versus energy security cost came out in favor of reopening Russian imports. Consider what that means in practical terms. The nation that the United States spent years attempting to isolate through the most aggressive sanctions campaign in recent memory has re-entered the global energy equation through the front door. Not through a back channel, not through intermediaries, through direct purchase by American buyers. The sanctions architecture that Washington built around Russian energy, the price caps, the shipping restrictions, the secondary sanctions threatening third-party buyers, has been partially dismantled by the same energy market pressures that Iran's Hormuz strategy was designed to create. Whether that was intentional coordination between Moscow and Tehran is an open question, but the effect is observable regardless of the intent. In 14 days of active conflict, 2 of the most significant elements of American economic leverage, the petrodollar's exclusivity and the Russian energy isolation framework, have both come under simultaneous structural pressure. That is not a coincidence. That is what strategic preparation meeting tactical opportunity looks like. Part 10. What the scoreboard actually shows. Two entirely separate scoreboards are tracking this conflict, and they are telling dramatically different stories about how it is progressing. The military scoreboard shows American advantages: superior firepower, precision strike capability demonstrated against high-value targets, naval presence in the region that no other power can match, Iranian forces absorbing damage, Iranian infrastructure degraded. By conventional military metrics, the United States is performing as expected. The financial scoreboard shows something considerably more complicated. Yuan-denominated transactions climbing each week. Chinese petroleum imports from Iranian sources increasing rather than decreasing despite American military pressure. Dollar-based tankers anchored outside Hormuz with no clear timeline for resumption. Iran selling approximately 1.2 million barrels of crude daily to Chinese buyers, less than pre-conflict volumes, but sufficient to keep revenue flowing, sufficient to fund ongoing operations, sufficient to sustain the financial leverage that the military campaign was designed to eliminate, but has failed to touch. Iran's nuclear materials remain protected inside mountain fortresses that conventional weapons cannot penetrate effectively. The strait remains sealed to dollar-denominated trade, despite overwhelming American naval presence. And China is accumulating deeply discounted energy supplies at scale, while paying precisely zero military costs for the conditions that made those discounts possible. Washington expected to hold significant financial leverage throughout this conflict. The expectation was that sanctions, combined with military pressure, would rapidly constrain Iranian capability. Instead, the alternative financial architecture that Iran and China built over years of quiet preparation is functioning as designed. The leverage is bending in unexpected directions. Part 11. The longer view. Step back from the 14-day timeline for a moment and consider the longer arc. The petrodollar system celebrated its 52nd anniversary on the day this military conflict officially began. Half a century of unchallenged dominance, half a century of structural global demand for American currency baked into the operating system of international commerce. Half a century of Washington borrowing cheaply, projecting force globally, and maintaining economic leverage that no other nation has come close to replicating. That arrangement was built on a handshake in 1974 between American diplomats and Saudi royalty. It was maintained through a combination of genuine utility. The dollar really was the most stable and liquid reserve currency available, and the implicit understanding that challenging it carried severe consequences. The consequences were demonstrated repeatedly. Nations that proposed alternative pricing arrangements tended to encounter significant political and military difficulties shortly afterward. The message was clear, and it was received. What has changed is not American willingness to defend the arrangement. What has changed is the availability of a credible alternative. For decades, nations that wanted to diversify away from dollar dependency had nowhere to go. The yuan was not freely convertible. Chinese financial infrastructure was not mature enough to handle global transaction volumes. The alternative did not exist in any operational sense. CIPS exists now. It processes hundreds of trillions in transaction volume annually. Chinese yuan is being held in central bank reserves across dozens of countries. Bilateral currency swap agreements between China and major trading nations have been signed across every region of the developing world. The technical and institutional infrastructure for an alternative to the petrodollar is not theoretical anymore. It is running. Iran's announcement did not create this alternative. It pointed a spotlight at something that already existed and asked the world to take it seriously. Part 12. What comes next? There are several possible trajectories from where this conflict stands today. In the first scenario, American military pressure succeeds in degrading Iranian capability to the point where the strait condition becomes unsustainable. Iran's leverage depends on its ability to enforce a distinction between yuan-denominated and dollar-denominated traffic. If that enforcement mechanism collapses under military pressure, the strait reopens on terms that preserve the petrodollar framework. The 14 days become a historical footnote rather than a turning point. Markets stabilize. The system continues. In the second scenario, negotiations produce a settlement that includes some formal or informal accommodation of yuan-based transactions without fully displacing dollar-based trade. A hybrid arrangement. Partial precedent. The petrodollar weakens at the margins but does not face a direct structural challenge. This is the outcome that financial analysts are quietly describing as the most likely medium-term resolution. In the third scenario, the yuan for Hormuz condition becomes established operational reality. Non-Chinese petroleum importers begin building yuan reserves. CIPS transaction volumes accelerate. The decades-long process of dollar reserve diversification, which has been progressing slowly for years, receives a sudden and significant acceleration. The petrodollar does not end, but it shares the global energy stage with a competing system for the first time in its history. Which scenario unfolds depends on factors that no analyst can predict with confidence. Military outcomes. Diplomatic negotiations happening behind closed doors. Decisions being made in government buildings in Beijing that will not be publicly disclosed for years. But this much is certain. The conversation has changed permanently. The question of whether the petrodollar system can be challenged at the point of physical oil flow has now been answered affirmatively. It can. It has been. For 14 days, the challenge has been running smoothly without resolution. Every government on Earth with significant energy import needs is calculating its response. Finance ministers are running reserve composition models. Central bankers are examining yuan allocation scenarios. Trade officials are exploring alternative supplier relationships and payment frameworks. Some of them will conclude that the dollar remains the only rational choice. Others will conclude that building optionality is worth the complexity. China completed those same calculations years ago and positioned accordingly. Closing. The missiles make spectacular television. The carrier strike groups project impressive symbolism. The Pentagon briefings cycle through satellite imagery that demonstrates genuine military capability. But underneath all of it, something considerably quieter is unfolding. The currency used to purchase the resource that powers modern civilization may be experiencing the first credible challenge to its exclusive dominance in 52 years. Not through dramatic announcement, not through a formal treaty or a surrender ceremony. Through accumulated daily transactions at a narrow maritime passage that is demonstrating, barrel by barrel, that the alternative works. The petrodollar system was built in a hotel room in 1974 through a handshake. It may be unwinding, slowly, incrementally, and then suddenly, through a single condition enforced at 33 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman. Pay in yuan, or remain anchored outside. That sentence may be the most consequential thing said in global finance in a generation. Not because it ends the system tomorrow, but because it proves, for the first time with operational evidence rather than theoretical argument, that the system can be challenged at its most essential point. Historians may look back on these 14 days as the moment the clock started, or they may look back and conclude the system proved more resilient than the pessimists believed. Either way, the world is watching, and the calculation is being made, quietly, in government buildings on every continent. I'm Catherine France. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is actually moving beneath the surface of this conflict, subscribe to this channel. This is exactly the kind of analysis we exist to provide. The financial architecture underneath the military headlines, the structural shifts that cable news does not have the patience to explain properly. Drop your perspective in the comments. Do you believe the petrodollar survives this challenge intact? Or are we watching the earliest chapters of a genuinely transformed financial order? The most valuable insights in these discussions come from the community, not from any single analyst. The conversation deserves to be had, and this is the place to have it.